What makes a person truly worthy of respect? Is it the number in their bank account, the size of their mansion, or the way they carry themselves in a room full of powerful people? Or could it be something much simpler, something invisible to the eye but undeniable to the heart? Imagine this, a glittering charity gala in Washington, D.C., chandeliers glowing, champagne glasses clinking, and cameras flashing as some of the most influential figures in the country gather to be seen. Among them stands Richard Hayes, a self-made millionaire, admired by some, envied by others, and feared by most. He is a man who believes that respect is bought, not earned, and tonight he intends to prove it. But in the same room, dressed simply, without diamonds or tailored suits, stands Sarah Miller. A schoolteacher from a struggling neighborhood, she doesn't have the wealth or the status of those around her. Yet she carries something different, an aura of quiet dignity, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be noticed. And when her path crosses with Richard's, when she extends her hand as a simple gesture of kindness and respect, something happens that silences the air. Richard looks at her, then looks at her hand, and with a cold smirk, he refuses. He pulls back. He turns away. And in that instant, every pair of eyes in the room feels the weight of his arrogance. Have you ever witnessed a moment like that? A moment where someone's pride or prejudice strips another person of the respect they deserve. Maybe you've lived it yourself, being overlooked, dismissed, or humiliated simply because someone thought you didn't belong. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next in this story may surprise you more than anything you expect. Richard believes he has made his point. To him, Sarah is invisible, a nobody, someone unworthy of acknowledgement in his carefully curated world of wealth and power. He thinks his gesture has elevated his image, solidified his authority, and reminded the room of the unspoken rule: money commands respect. But what Richard doesn't realize is that the world is about to remind him of a very different rule, one that cannot be bought with dollars or displayed with diamonds. Sarah, meanwhile, doesn't flinch. Her eyes lower slightly, but her composure remains steady. There is no anger in her face, no bitterness in her posture, only the kind of resilience that comes from a life where respect is not handed out freely, but where dignity is protected fiercely. And the silence that follows Richard's refusal is more powerful than his action. It lingers, it spreads. The gala, once full of shallow laughter, suddenly feels heavy, as if everyone present knows they've just witnessed something shameful. What you're about to discover now may change the way you look at moments of arrogance and injustice. Because just as Richard thinks the night belongs to him, the sound of the doors opening announces the arrival of someone else, someone whose presence will flip the entire narrative upside down. The President of the United States is about to walk into that room, and with one single gesture, with one single word, everything Richard believes about respect, power, and status is about to collapse before his eyes. And maybe as you picture that moment, the silence in the room, the weight of one man's arrogance pressing down on a woman who only offered kindness, you start to feel something stir inside you. Because these scenes aren't just about Richard or Sarah. They're reflections of real-life moments we've all seen or even lived through, times when respect was denied, times when dignity was tested, times when someone chose pride over compassion. If any of this resonates with you, I'd truly love to hear your voice. Share your thoughts in the comments below, whether it's a memory, an opinion, or simply how this story makes you feel. Your perspective might touch someone else who reads it, reminding them they're not alone. That's the power of this community. It grows not just from the stories told, but from the stories shared back. And while you're here, if this kind of content speaks to you, if you want to keep exploring these powerful lessons hidden inside everyday dramas, take a second to like this video. It might seem like a small action, but it's what tells me that these narratives matter, that they reach the hearts they're meant to reach. Every like is a signal that says, yes, this is worth continuing. More than that if you feel this space is one you want to keep walking through with me, hit that subscribe button. It's how you and I stay connected, how you make sure you're here for the next story, the next lesson, the next twist that reminds us all of what truly matters. Because every subscription doesn't just help this channel grow, it helps keep these messages alive, reaching more people who may need to hear them at just the right moment. So stay close, because this story is far from over. The doors are opening, the air is shifting, and the most powerful presence in the room is about to show everyone, including Richard Hayes, what true respect really looks like. Richard Hayes had built his empire brick by brick, dollar by dollar, until the name Hayes became synonymous with power. He wasn't born into wealth, but once he tasted it, he clung to it with a grip so tight it defined every decision he made. His story was the kind celebrated in glossy magazines, the boy from Ohio who rose from a modest background to dominate the financial world. To the outside eye, his life looked like a triumph, a transformation that proved ambition could overcome anything. But if you stepped behind the curtain, if you dared to peek behind the polished image, you would see something else. A man who believed that money wasn't just power. To him, it was the only measure of worth. Every morning, Richard's day began the same way. A chauffeur waiting at the curb, the engine of his custom black Cadillac, Escalade purring softly in the driveway of his penthouse overlooking the Potomac. The penthouse itself was a fortress of glass and steel, the kind of place where floor-to-ceiling windows gave him a constant view of the city, as if reminding him daily that the world was beneath him. He walked past original paintings worth millions, Italian marble floors polished so brightly they could blind you, and rare sculptures that he barely even noticed anymore. To Richard, these weren't art. They were proof. Proof that he had arrived, proof that he belonged above others, proof that no one could question his place at the table. When Richard spoke, people listened, not because of the wisdom in his words, but because of the weight of his wallet. Respect isn't given, it's bought, he once said to a group of new executives during a meeting. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a fairy tale. It was this mindset that guided him through every handshake, every deal, every social interaction. Respect wasn't about character sacrifice or compassion. It was a transaction, and Richard considered himself a master of the market. On the nights he chose to mingle, he preferred high-profile galas and charity dinners, the kind where every camera flashed and every glass of wine cost more than what most people earned in a week. These events weren't about generosity for him. They were about exposure, about power networking, about being seen in the right place with the right people. He smiled for the photographs, but the smile never reached his eyes. A room is only worth being in if everyone knows your name, he often muttered, adjusting his cufflinks while glancing at others with a silent sense of superiority. Richard loved to be driven through the streets of Washington, D.C. at night, the city lights reflecting off the tinted windows of his car. He would look out and see people waiting at bus stops, parents holding their children's hands, tired workers heading home. After long shifts, to him they were part of a different world, a world he had escaped. Sometimes he'd shake his head and whisper to himself, they just didn't try hard enough. In his mind, every person who struggled was simply someone who hadn't made the right decisions, hadn't had the right mindset. He erased the complexities of their lives with one cold assumption. They were beneath him. What made Richard so striking wasn't just his wealth, it was his disdain for anything that reminded him of the man he used to be. He dressed in tailored suits so sharp they looked like armor, always paired with a luxury watch. Usually a Patek Philippe or a Rolex, each one carefully chosen to reflect his mood and the image he wanted to project. He despised casual encounters, avoided small talk with strangers, and refused to engage with anyone who didn't add value to his journey. If a waiter brought him the wrong order, his glare alone was enough to paralyze the poor man. If an employee missed a deadline, Richard didn't ask why. He simply called it a failure, and failures were unforgivable. In his private moments, Richard would pace his penthouse office, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled not with literature or history, but with volumes on finance, power strategies, and biographies of other wealthy men he admired. He'd stop at the window and look down at the streets below, whispering under his breath, "The world is a chessboard, and I don't play to lose." That line had become his personal mantra, a constant reminder that to him, life was not about connection or compassion. It was about control. Still, there was something hollow about the way he carried himself, something hidden behind the smirk and the tailored clothes. When people laughed at his jokes, it was never genuine laughter. It was forced, carefully measured, the kind of laughter that comes from people who need something from you. And Richard knew it, but he didn't mind. To him, fear and dependency were as good as admiration. "Better they fake respect than show their true colors," he once said at a private dinner, clinking his glass of bourbon against a diamond cufflink. This was the man who would stand in that glittering ballroom in Washington, the chandeliers burning bright above when Sarah Miller extended her hand. This was the man who, in front of everyone, smirked and pulled his own hand back as if to say, "You are not worthy." The gesture wasn't just arrogance. It was decades of mindset, decades of decisions, decades of believing in a hidden truth he had built for himself, that respect flowed upward, never downward, and that wealth was the only currency that mattered in the game of life. But what Richard failed to realize was that the very foundation of his belief was already cracking. The image he fought so hard to protect, the impact he thought his presence commanded, was about to be tested in a way he never could have predicted. And as much as he believed he was the one holding all, the power in the room, the reality was shifting in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. For now, Richard Hayes stood tall, shoulders squared, convinced that he was untouchable. His empire, his reputation, his carefully crafted identity, all of it seemed unshakable. Yet behind the polished glass of his world, behind the smug smile he wore so easily, an unseen tide was already moving. And when it reached him, it would not only shake the image he projected, it would tear down the very walls he had built around himself, exposing what had been hidden for far too long. Sarah Miller was not the kind of woman who usually appeared in rooms lined with marble floors, gold-trimmed mirrors and chandeliers sparkling like falling stars. While most of the guests at the Washington Gala wore gowns worth more than a teacher's annual salary, Sarah's dress was simple, navy blue cotton, pressed carefully at home, the faintest touch of perfume lingering around her like a whisper. She didn't come to be seen, to impress, or to prove anything. She came because she was invited, not as a socialite, but as someone whose quiet work in the shadows had been recognized by those who understood its real impact. Her life was worlds away from Richard Hayes's penthouse and luxury cars. Every morning, before the sun even peeked over the skyline, Sarah was already awake in her modest two-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. She brewed coffee in a chipped ceramic mug, packed lesson materials into a worn-out tote bag, and double-checked the notes for her after-school program. The peeling paint on the hallway walls didn't bother her, nor did the hum of old radiators that never seemed to heat evenly in the winter. For Sarah, comfort wasn't measured by what she owned, but by the lives she touched. And every time she looked at the faces of the children in her classroom, some hungry, some tired, some carrying burdens far too heavy for their age, she was reminded why she chose this path. "Miss Miller, are we going to do the reading circle today?" a little boy had asked her just the week before, his eyes wide with hope. "Of course," she'd smiled, kneeling to his height, "and you'll get to lead us through the first page." That was who Sarah was, the kind of teacher who remembered every child's favorite book, who noticed when one of them wore the same shirt 3 days in a row, who brought extra sandwiches from home just in case someone forgot their lunch again. She wasn't rich in dollars, but she was overflowing in a kind of wealth few ever understood. Her program, "The Future Starts Here," was born out of her belief that no child should feel invisible. It wasn't backed by millionaires or corporations. It was fueled by her paychecks, community donations, and long nights spent writing grants on her kitchen table. Over the years, that small program had grown into a safe haven for dozens of children, a place where they could discover not just math and reading, but also confidence, kindness, and the strength to dream. And yet, as she walked into the grand ballroom that night, Sarah felt the weight of being out of place. Her shoes weren't designer, her hair wasn't styled by a professional, and her jewelry was nothing more than a silver chain her mother had given her years ago. Still, she carried herself with a grace that no diamond necklace could buy. Heads turned, not because she sparkled, but because there was something different about her presence. She didn't demand attention. She simply embodied it. The truth is, Sarah never thought of herself as extraordinary. "I just do what I can," she often said when people praised her. But what she didn't see was the transformation she had already sparked. Many of her former students had gone on to college. Some became teachers themselves. Others started small businesses, and nearly all of them returned to thank her. "You made me believe I could," one young woman told her after becoming the first in her family to graduate. Sarah had smiled through tears, replying softly, "No, you always could. You just needed someone to remind you." This was the woman who stood across from Richard Hayes that night, offering her hand in nothing but kindness. She didn't see herself as less than him, nor did she see herself as greater. To Sarah, a handshake was simply a gesture of mutual respect, a recognition that every person in the room shared the same humanity. When Richard pulled back with that smirk, Sarah felt the sting, not for herself, but for what it revealed about him. She lowered her eyes briefly, then lifted them again, steady, calm, refusing to let humiliation shape her spirit. The contrast between them couldn't have been sharper. Richard's power was built on possessions and appearances. Sarah's strength came from humility and purpose. He measured his worth by the size of his empire. She measured hers by the smiles of children who once believed they didn't matter. He wore arrogance like a crown. She wore compassion like an invisible shield. Inside her, though, there was no bitterness. She had seen enough of life's cruelty to understand that arrogance was often just fear in disguise. She could have resented Richard, could have snapped back with words that cut deeper than silence, but that wasn't who she was. Instead, she stood quietly, her hand lowering to her side, her expression unbroken. And in that moment, she revealed something few in the room expected to see, a kind of strength that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, but simply exists. The irony was not lost on the observers. Here was a woman who had built something lasting, something that transformed lives every single day, being treated as though she were invisible. And here was a man who built skyscrapers of glass and steel, but couldn't muster the courage to acknowledge a simple act of humanity. People in the crowd exchanged glances, some awkward, some disapproving, but no one spoke. The silence, after his refusal, carried a weight far heavier than any words could. Sarah's story wasn't one of wealth or headlines, but of choices and impact. She could have pursued a safer career, one that promised stability and comfort, but she had chosen a journey that often left her exhausted, stretched thin, and financially uncertain. And yet, she never regretted it. "This is where I'm supposed to be," she once told a friend, her voice quiet but certain. It was that mindset, that decision to place meaning over money, that defined her. Her presence at the gala wasn't just an accident of invitation, it was a recognition of the hidden truth behind her life's work. While most guests were there to be photographed and applauded, Sarah was there because someone had noticed the impact she was making behind the scenes. Her name might not have carried weight in financial circles, but in the lives of the children she taught, Sarah Miller was a giant. And as she stood in that opulent ballroom, humiliated but unshaken, no one could have predicted the revelation that was about to unfold. No one could have foreseen how, in just a few minutes, the balance of power in that room would shift so dramatically. Sarah remained still, her quiet strength unbroken, while Richard basked in his false victory, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to move. The orchestra played softly in the background, violins weaving a melody that was meant to make the room feel sophisticated, refined, almost untouchable. But beneath the glitter of chandeliers and the murmur of elegant conversation, there was a tension no music could smooth over. Richard Hayes stood with his shoulders squared, his glass of champagne tilted carelessly in one hand, and his smirk sharpened into something almost cruel. He leaned toward the man standing beside him, another wealthy donor in a tuxedo, and whispered just loudly enough for a few nearby ears to catch, "She doesn't belong here. Look at her. This is a gala, not a PTA meeting." The man chuckled nervously, though his laugh had no conviction. It was the kind of sound people made when they didn't agree, but lacked the courage to push back against someone who carried influence. Richard basked in that moment, the small victory of having someone nod at his arrogance. He didn't even realize that the room had shifted, that eyes were beginning to follow him, not with admiration, but with discomfort. Sarah Miller, standing just a few feet away, heard, "Enough." The words weren't directed at her face, but they might as well have been. Still, she didn't flinch. She adjusted the strap of her tote-style evening bag, an accessory completely out of place among glittering clutches and designer purses, and held her head a little higher. It wasn't the first time she had been treated as invisible. Life in underfunded schools, crowded classrooms, and communities where opportunities seemed scarce had already shown her how society often measured value. She was used to being underestimated, but that didn't mean the sting of it faded. The contrast between them was almost cinematic. Richard's presence screamed wealth, custom-tailored suit, gold cufflinks that glinted under the light, shoes polished to a mirror finish. He carried himself like a man who believed the world turned because he commanded it. Every gesture was deliberate, as if rehearsed, a behind-the-scenes performance of arrogance meant to keep everyone reminded of his place at the top. Sarah's presence, by comparison, was gentle, grounded. Her dress was modest, but her posture carried quiet confidence. She had calluses on her hands from years of writing on chalkboards, rearranging classroom desks, and helping children with projects that required more creativity than resources. She wore no jewels except the chain her mother had given her, and yet there was a radiance in her simplicity that no amount of diamonds could replicate. Richard leaned again toward his circle of admirers. "Can you imagine?" he scoffed, his voice carrying more now. "She runs some little program for kids who can't even afford lunch, and they put her name next to ours? What impact could she possibly have?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "This is charity theater at its finest." For a split second, Sarah's eyes met his. It wasn't a glare, nor a plea. It was steady, calm, as though she was looking not at Richard the millionaire, but at Richard the man who had once been a boy himself. The look unsettled him, though he would never admit it. He turned away quickly, hiding behind another sip of champagne, pretending he hadn't noticed. Around them, the divide was impossible to ignore. One side of the room buzzed with shallow conversation about investments, mergers, and vacations in the Hamptons. The other side, where Sarah stood, seemed quieter, more restrained, as though her presence cast an invisible line no one dared to cross. Some guests looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, but few with the respect she deserved. She felt the imbalance pressing down on her, yet she refused to let it steal her composure. In moments like this, Sarah often thought of her students. She remembered Marcus, who used to skip meals so his younger sister could eat, or Lily, who wore shoes 2 sizes too small because her family couldn't afford new ones. She remembered how invisible they often felt in the world outside the classroom, how easy it was for people like Richard to dismiss them as statistics. And she knew, deep down, that every ounce of dignity she carried into that room wasn't just for herself, it was for them. "I've been told I don't belong before," she once said to a colleague, But belonging isn't something other people decide for me. It's something I choose. Those words echoed in her heart as she stood in the ballroom, enduring the humiliation in silence. The divide wasn't just in wealth, it was in mindset. Richard saw the world as a hierarchy, a ladder where only those at the top mattered. Sarah saw it as a community, a web of lives where even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outward and create transformation. He believed status gave him the right to humiliate. She believed humility gave her the strength to endure. The whispers grew louder, the sidelong glances sharper. Richard's confidence swelled with every sneer, convinced he had reinforced his place in the invisible hierarchy of the evening. He relished the performance, certain no one would challenge him. Yet beneath the surface a shift was happening. People began to notice not just Richard's arrogance, but Sarah's quiet refusal to break. The hidden truth was surfacing. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. The weight of the imbalance pressed on everyone watching. Some sipped their drinks faster, as if trying to swallow their discomfort. Others adjusted their ties or gowns, their eyes darting back and forth between Richard and Sarah. The humiliation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, and yet Sarah's silence carried more power than any argument could have. Richard leaned in once more, this time speaking even more boldly. "Mark my words," he said with a self-satisfied grin. "Tonight's about real power, and she has none." But as the orchestra swelled into a louder refrain and the master of ceremonies stepped toward the microphone, the energy in the room shifted. Richard couldn't feel it yet, but everyone else could. What he thought was dominance was beginning to look like desperation, and what he thought was invisibility was beginning to shine brighter than any spotlight. And then, almost like the turning of a page in a story no one saw coming, the room began to hush, not because of Richard's words, but because something else was about to happen, something that would reveal a truth far larger than his arrogance could ever hide. Sarah took a careful step forward, the soft fabric of her navy dress catching a sliver of chandelier light as if to steady her. She wasn't trying to make a scene, she was trying to honor the moment. The master of ceremonies had just finished the welcome, the orchestra resting on a delicate pause, and the hush felt like an opening placed there on purpose. She crossed the few feet between them with the same calm she carried into crowded hallways at school, the calm that convinces frightened kids to try again. When she stopped in front of Richard Hayes, she offered what seemed like the simplest bridge two people can build, her hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said, voice warm but measured, "thank you for supporting tonight. I'm Sarah Miller." It wasn't a plea for favor. It wasn't an angle for access. It was a greeting between citizens of the same room, the same city, the same country, one that should have required nothing more than a reciprocal gesture. Richard glanced at her outstretched hand, the way a man glances at a smudge on his window. The movement of his jaw tightened, then settled into that familiar smirk. He let the moment breathe just long enough to pull eyes toward them, curious eyes, wary eyes, the kind trained by years of galas to sense when something unscripted is about to happen. Then he made his decision. He shifted his champagne glass to the other hand, not to accept hers, but to tuck his free hand behind his back like a magistrate withholding pardon. The refusal wasn't loud, yet it radiated through the room with more impact than a raised voice. The power of a decision is often measured by what it denies, and he denied her the minimum acknowledgement of shared humanity. "I don't shake hands," he murmured, the words thin as paper but sharpened to cut. His tone said the quiet part out loud. "Not with you." The air stilled. The orchestra's next note never arrived. Somewhere, a server halted mid-step, the tray's crystal stems chiming softly against one another as the motion froze. Sarah's hand remained there for a heartbeat longer, as if giving him a final chance to reconsider, then she lowered it with the kind of grace that looks small until you understand what it costs. "Understood," she said, barely above a whisper. though it carried enough to be heard by anyone who needed to hear it. There was no tremble in her voice, but there was weight. It was the weight of every lunch she had packed for a kid who didn't have one, every after-school hour spent guiding a child through long division and grief in the same breath, every quiet decision to believe that kindness still changes outcomes. "It's all right." The words were for him and for herself, and for the room that needed permission to breathe again. Richard's smirk deepened. He took a measured sip of champagne, letting the bubbles provide the punctuation he felt the moment deserved. In his mind, he had displayed control. He had reinforced the code he lived by. Status is not exchanged. It is protected. The refusal was his version of a brand statement, the kind people in advertising billboards call positioning, and he believed it set him above. He glanced sideways at the donors clustered near him, quietly expecting approval. A few gave him the kind of half-smiles people offer when they've already done the math of self-preservation. Others looked down, embarrassed for reasons they couldn't name. It is a strange thing, how quickly a room becomes a mirror. On the surface, nothing changed. Music still waited to resume, light still flickered and glowed. Camera flashes still sparked in the corners, but the reflection shifted. In the silence, the hidden truth of the evening began to show. Power isn't just a matter of money, it's a matter of mindset. And the mindset on display was smaller than the suit that carried it. Sarah didn't retreat. She drew a slow breath that loosened the fist inside her ribs and straightened her shoulders, not out of pride, but out of habit. The habit of steadying herself so children could steady themselves too. Her eyes met his, gentle but unyielding, and for a second he had to look away, because there was nothing in that gaze he could buy or bend. She turned slightly, giving space that didn't look like surrender, and allowed the moment to land where it belonged, on him. Inside the ring of onlookers, a woman in a silver gown pressed her lips together, as if to hold in the apology she wished someone else would offer. A young staffer from the organizing committee, tie loosened from running last-minute logistics, stared as if memorizing what courage looks like when it refuses to burn others for heat. Farther back, a photographer lowered his camera, unwilling to capture a frame that would feel like a bruise. The humiliation, when it came, did not belong to Sarah. It hung on the man who confused superiority with stature and imagined that dignity could be rationed like place settings. "I've had a long day," Richard added, as though he needed a reason to make his refusal sound like policy. "You understand." It was the kind of line a man throws like a tarp over a broken fence, hoping no one notices the gap. "I do," Sarah replied, steady. "Long days have a way of showing us who we are." There it was, the line that rose without poison, the line that held up a mirror without shattering it. Not a clapback, a revelation. In another life, in another set of decisions, perhaps Richard would have heard it as an invitation to a different posture. Tonight, he heard it as an irritant. His smirk tried to turn the room into an audience, but the room had already shifted into a jury. The silence began stretching in that peculiar way silence stretches when a boundary has been crossed, and people are waiting to see if someone will draw it back. The orchestra leader looked to the master of ceremonies for a signal. A server moved again, carefully, as if sound itself might crack. Time, when it carries injustice, grows heavy. It presses on chests and slows thought, making every heartbeat feel like a footstep on marble. In that heaviness, Sarah experienced the familiar twin awareness she carried through underfunded corridors every day, the sting of being dismissed and the stubborn hope that dignity is not contingent on the person across from you. She thought of Marcus, who once told her, "People only see me when I'm in trouble," and of Lily, who confessed, "I learned to be quiet so nobody notices I need help." She felt them all standing with her, not as a chorus of pity, but as a chorus of purpose, reminding her that visibility earned in caretaking does not disappear in cruelty. "I'm fine," she said, more to the moment than to the man, and the words threaded through the hush like a stitch. It wasn't defiance dressed as bravado. It was the discipline of a mindset formed by service, Behind the scenes of nights like these, behind the glitter and the carefully scripted speeches, there is always a ledger running, a quiet accounting of impact. Most people can't read it, because it isn't written in dollars. It's written in the transformations that don't trend. A child choosing kindness over retaliation. A teenager finishing a college application he almost abandoned. A family learning that asking for help is a kind of courage. Sarah's ledger was full, and though none of it showed on a nameplate, it grew in the silence now circling the room. "This is a gala, not a classroom," Richard remarked softly, a sideways blade of a sentence meant only for her. "Different rules." Sarah held his gaze, not to challenge him, but to keep him from vanishing into the comfort of his own narrative. "Kindness doesn't rewrite itself by venue," she said, each word clear without heat. "It travels." That was the moment several guests realized something they might never admit out loud. The person with the most composure here wasn't the man with the penthouse view. It was the woman who spent her evenings printing worksheets on a cheap home printer, and her mornings reminding kids that failure is information, not a verdict. The gap between who the city celebrated and who the city needed was standing in plain view, and it was wider than anyone wanted to believe. Richard glanced past her, looking for something to reclaim the momentum. Another donor, a joke, a distraction. He had engineered his life to avoid this exact sensation, exposure without control. He wanted music to resume, conversation to reset, the scene to be archived as a footnote, yet the room refused to collude. Silence can be a verdict when words refuse to serve. He pivoted slightly, angling his body toward his circle, signaling that the exchange was over, but the exchange had already traveled beyond him. It had entered the bloodstream of the evening, and people felt it the way a system feels a change in pressure, subtle then undeniable. A man at the edge of the group cleared his throat, a tiny sound that somehow rang. The master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone. The orchestra leader lifted his bow, then paused. Again, the lights seemed to grow warmer, as if leaning toward the pivot everyone sensed was imminent. The human journey is full of tiny doors. Some open soundlessly, some announce themselves. When a door is about to swing, the air learns to listen. As Richard stood there, believing he had restored the order he preferred, the room learned to listen. And for Sarah, whose life trained her to hear what others miss, the listening felt familiar. A pause that precedes revelations, a breath that separates injury from meaning. She did not need an apology to claim her steadiness. She had already made the decision that steadiness would not be negotiable. "You can keep your hand," she might have said if the night had asked for a harder edge, but it didn't. The night asked for witness. It asked for adults to notice what children have always known. The real curriculum is written in how we treat each other when no rubric is measuring it. Sarah turned slightly, not to leave, but to release the moment from locking around just the two of them. Her eyes passed over faces, curious, conflicted, learning. If there was humiliation, she refused to carry it. If there was power, she refused to steal it. A door somewhere at the back of the ballroom opened with a soft, hydraulic sigh, and though the sound was small, people felt it, not the creak of an exit, the invitation of an entrance. The orchestra leader looked up. The master of ceremonies drew breath. Richard lifted his chin as if greeting the inevitable spotlight. Sarah's heartbeat steadied into the rhythm she knew from 100 difficult parent-teacher conferences, from fire drills, from the narrow victories of days when the copier broke and a child cried, and still, somehow, progress happened. The room, once frozen by a refusal, began to tilt toward something else, something that would not erase the insult, but would contextualize it. In that tilt, the inequality that had strutted a moment ago began to shrink, not because money lost value, but because value found a different metric. The next note of the night hovered, unplayed but fully formed, ready to show everyone what the script had never dared to promise. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened, with a sound that was almost too soft for the weight it carried. A hush, moved across the space like a tide pulling back before the crash. Then came the words that shifted every spine in the room, words amplified by the master of ceremonies' steady voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the President of the United States." Chairs scraped against polished floors, heels tapped in hurried rhythm as the entire room stood as one. The orchestra struck a triumphant chord, brass and strings rising with urgency, as if the very air knew history had stepped inside. Applause erupted, thunderous and unified, swallowing the awkward silence that Richard's refusal had left behind. Richard Hayes straightened immediately, instinctively drawing his shoulders back, his jaw firming into a polished smile. He lifted his glass as though rehearsing the posture of recognition he believed was owed to him. The smirk he had worn for Sarah was gone, replaced by an expression carefully engineered for cameras, for attention, for validation. This was the stage he craved, the spotlight he believed belonged to him. "Finally," Richard muttered under his breath, straightening his tie with one sharp tug. To the donors clustered nearby, he whispered, "Now you'll see why I'm here." His words carried the conviction of a man who had convinced himself the night was building toward his own coronation. The president's arrival was not, in Richard's mind, about the office or the authority. It was about proximity. If power entered the room, he believed, it would inevitably orbit him. Sarah, still standing quietly near the center, folded her hands gently in front of her. She had no rehearsed expression, no calculated pose for the cameras. The applause rose around her, but she didn't join in immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes for a breath, steadying herself in the shift of energy. When she opened them, she watched as the crowd craned their necks toward the doors, desperate for a glimpse, desperate to be near authority, as though nearness alone could transform them. The president entered, flanked by security and advisors, the gravity of the office preceding each step. The applause grew louder, echoing against the walls until it seemed impossible to separate one set of hands from another. Guests clapped not only out of respect, but out of calculation, each hoping to be noticed, to be acknowledged, to be remembered. Richard clapped too, but his applause was shallow, his eyes darting like a chess player scanning for moves. "This is it," he whispered again, a mantra of anticipation. For Richard, this was the hidden truth of why he attended nights like these. It wasn't philanthropy, it wasn't charity, it wasn't even vanity, it was access. These galas were the behind-the-scenes corridors where alliances were forged, where photos became leverage, where nods from authority could be cashed later for influence. He had built his empire not only on money, but on these decisions, these carefully curated nights, where proximity was the real currency. He had no doubt that tonight, with the president present, he would secure another thread of power woven into his already thick tapestry. The applause began to settle, but the energy did not fade. The president moved slowly into the room, smiling, shaking a few hands, exchanging brief words that carried more impact than their brevity suggested. Cameras flashed, guests angled their bodies for better positions, and Richard inched forward, ready to intercept the orbit he thought inevitable. "Richard Hayes," he rehearsed silently, already imagining the handshake, the photograph, the ripple it would send through tomorrow's headlines. He pictured his name in the press release, imagined his image next to the nation's leader, the visual confirmation of the authority he claimed. His mind raced with the narrative he would craft. The wealthy man aligned with power, validated by the highest seat in the land. Sarah watched the scene unfold with different eyes. She wasn't calculating or positioning. She was observing, noticing the way authority could transform a room. She thought of her students, how they would sit up straighter when the principal entered the classroom, how they suddenly became quieter, more careful, as if authority itself carried an invisible force. But she also thought of the lessons she tried to teach them. That respect was not about fear, not about status, but about recognition of shared humanity. Watching Richard's posture swell with expectation, she understood he had never learned that lesson. The president paused mid-room, shaking hands with donors whose names filled the program, acknowledging political figures who had been strategically seated in the front rows. Richard's eyes followed the movements obsessively, his pulse quickening as the distance closed. He adjusted his cufflinks again, checked his stance, lifted his chin. To him, everything pointed to the inevitable moment when his hand would be clasped, his worth confirmed, his superiority broadcast. But the arc of authority does not always bend toward expectation. The room, still alive with curiosity and suspense, felt the shift before Richard did. The president's gaze passed over him, not unkindly, but without pause, as though he were another face in the sea of polished tuxedos and sequined gowns. The smile that followed was directed elsewhere, toward the modest figure who had stood quiet all evening, the woman Richard had treated as invisible. Applause faltered into a murmur as people realized the trajectory. Sarah lowered her eyes instinctively, uncertain, but then raised them again when she saw the president's steps deliberate, unhurried, carrying purpose. Richard blinked, confused, his body still frozen in the expectation of recognition. He hadn't yet understood that the very authority he was certain belonged to him was about to redefine itself in front of everyone. The journey of a moment can feel like a lifetime. Every step the president took shifted the balance of the room, transforming not just positions, but perceptions. Richard's smirk wavered, his certainty unraveling as the air thickened with revelation. The crowd, sensing something larger than politics, leaned closer, waiting for the impact of what was about to unfold. The president's steps were deliberate, each one echoing with the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going. The donors leaned in, expecting him to pause at Richard's side, to clasp hands with the millionaire whose name appeared on every sponsorship banner in the room. Richard himself stood ready, shoulders squared, lips pulled into a practiced smile that said, "I deserve this moment." He believed the path of authority would naturally bend toward wealth, that recognition would be drawn to him as if by gravity. But the trajectory betrayed his expectation. The president's gaze slipped past him, warm yet unpausing, like a river bypassing a stone. His smile widened, not at the titan of finance waiting so eagerly, but at the modest figure just behind him, the woman who had been invisible only moments ago. "Sarah," the president said, his voice clear enough to ripple across the hall. The applause softened into surprise, the kind of hush that follows an unexpected revelation. He stepped forward, closing the last few feet between them, and without hesitation he opened his arms. Sarah, startled but steady, accepted the embrace. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing an image no one in the room had rehearsed. "My dear friend," the president continued, his tone threaded with affection and respect, "you don't know how much it means to see you here tonight." Richard's smile faltered, his body frozen in the posture of a man whose script had been torn from his hands. He blinked, as though trying to adjust his vision, as though surely this wasn't what everyone else was seeing. But it was. The most powerful person in the room had bypassed him completely, choosing instead to honor the woman he had humiliated only moments before. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her composure nearly breaking. "Mr. President," she whispered, her voice trembling with both humility and disbelief. "I never imagined—" The president cut her off with a gentle laugh, one that carried warmth rather than condescension. "You never imagined, but I have. I've seen what you've built. I've watched the lives you've touched. Sarah, you are the kind of leader this nation desperately needs." The words hung in the air, heavier than chandeliers, brighter than the gilded walls. They weren't empty compliments meant for applause. They carried the weight of recognition earned through years of tireless work. He spoke not of her title or her appearance, but of her impact. The countless children who had found hope in her classrooms, the families who had been lifted out of cycles of despair because she believed education was more than lessons, it was transformation. I've visited schools across this country, he said, turning now to address the crowd while keeping Sarah close at his side. But I can tell you this. The work Sarah Miller has done in her community, the sacrifices she has made, the future she has fought for, it is nothing short of extraordinary. We talk so often about change in Washington, but real change, the kind that transforms lives, begins with people like her. Gasps rippled through the audience, subtle but undeniable. Guests shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, some nodding in agreement, others blinking in surprise as if seeing Sarah for the first time. The invisible line that had separated her from the rest of the room dissolved in an instant, replaced by something much stronger, respect that could no longer be denied. Richard's hand tightened around the stem of his glass, his knuckles whitening. The smirk he had worn so easily earlier was gone, replaced by the stiff mask of a man suddenly aware of the fragility of his carefully constructed world. His decisions, his mindset, his belief that money alone could dictate worth, they all cracked beneath the weight of that embrace. He had thought authority would validate him, but authority had revealed a hidden truth instead. Respect doesn't flow toward arrogance, it flows toward integrity. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "I only did what I thought was right," she murmured, words that nearly disappeared under the applause that swelled again, stronger now, this time directed not at wealth or position, but at her. The president smiled knowingly, his voice rising just above the clapping hands. "That's what makes it so powerful. You weren't chasing recognition, Sarah. You were. Chasing justice, dignity, opportunity, that is leadership in its purest form. And that," he paused, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, "is what this country should be applauding tonight." The ovation grew louder, a chorus of acknowledgement Sarah had never asked for, but deeply deserved. It wasn't just noise, it was a revelation, the sound of a crowd awakening to the impact of one woman's journey, the kind of impact that could never be measured in donations or photographs. Richard tried to recover, forcing a weak clap, but even he felt the futility of the gesture. The room had shifted beyond his control. Authority had chosen its subject, and it wasn't him. The narrative he had tried to own had slipped into someone else's hands, the hands he had refused to shake. Sarah stood taller, though not out of pride. It was something different, something deeper. It was the strength of a woman who had carried the weight of invisibility for too long and was finally being seen, not for what she wore, not for where she stood, but for who she was. Her humility remained intact, but in that moment, the nation's highest authority made sure everyone knew she belonged. And as the applause thundered once more, echoing across the grand ballroom, the atmosphere changed entirely. What had begun as a display of arrogance had transformed into a revelation about worth, dignity, and the power of unseen labor. The light seemed warmer, the air clearer, as though the room itself understood that something had been set right. The president leaned closer, speaking softly enough for only Sarah to hear, though her trembling smile suggested the words struck deep. "Sarah, you've lifted more children out of poverty than some of these men have ever bothered to notice. Never doubt your place. It was always here." She swallowed hard, nodding gently, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you. But it's not about me. It's about them, the kids." The president's smile widened. "And that's why it is about you." The room, still clapping, waited for what would happen next, as though the night had been rewritten before their eyes. And in many ways, it had. The hidden truth had surfaced, and the journey of one teacher from the shadows of a neighborhood classroom to the spotlight of national recognition was no longer just her story. It was the story of what real power looks like when authority decides to honor the overlooked. The applause softened into murmurs again, the orchestra waiting for its cue. And yet the energy in the air refused to settle. It lingered, charged, as though everyone knew the evening was far from finished. that the revelation had only set the stage for something even greater about to unfold. Richard's name still gleamed from the program, stamped beside platinum sponsorship tiers and a paragraph about visionary leadership. But in the wake of the embrace he had not received, the letters seemed to dim. He held himself like a statue that hadn't decided which expression to keep, lips half-curved, eyes not sure where to land, fingers gripping the stem of his glass too tightly. The applause for Sarah receded into a textured hush, and yet the echo of it stayed, like a tide mark higher than anyone expected. The very hand he had refused a minute earlier was now the hand the president had sought first, the one lifted and honored not as a prop, but as a proof. It was the kind of revelation that does not require commentary. It clarifies without a single argument. What breaks a man like Richard is not volume, it's contrast. He believed the room existed to confirm his thesis that money equals respect, exposure equals influence, proximity equals power. But authority had chosen another orbit. The grind of years that had hardened his mindset suddenly met a soft force it couldn't dismiss. The hidden truth didn't arrive as a reprimand from a rival. It arrived as recognition given to someone he had decided didn't count. The blow landed quietly, and that's why it landed completely. He tried to reset. He angled his body so the cameras might catch him at a flattering profile near the president. He lifted his chin, smoothed his cuff, and prepared a genial smile in case attention drifted back. It didn't. The president's words about Sarah's impact, about the children who now read without fear, the teenagers who now planned futures instead of surviving days, kept weaving through the crowd, rearranging the room's measure of worth. People who had laughed cautiously at Richard's earlier quips now looked towards Sarah with genuine curiosity, the kind reserved for someone whose life contains a map. "Mr. President, perhaps we should," Richard began, stepping forward, but the sentence had nowhere to land. The president was still speaking with Sarah, and the staff closest to him were attentive to her answers, not his interruptions. Someone touched Richard's elbow with the polite pressure used to move obstacles without naming them. He drew his arm back. Heat rising beneath his collar. Humiliation, when it is clean, does not shout. It reorganizes the room's gravity. Richard felt the shift in his body before he could name it. The applause had carved a new center. He was off it. He watched as board chairs, cabinet-level officials, and city leaders formed a small, respectful semicircle around Sarah, not the crowding swarm reserved for celebrity, but the careful, listening shape that forms around a story people realize they should have known sooner. She did not perform. She answered questions with the same plainness she used in classrooms, words shaped by decisions made in rooms without chandeliers. "I just try to create places where kids feel safe to fail and try again," she said, voice steady. "When they stop bracing for the worst, they start choosing better." The line moved through the air like a key sliding into a lock, and Richard felt the mechanism in himself resist. He had built a life on the physics of leverage, on deals where someone always braced for the worst. Respect to him was credit extended to those who could repay it with interest. Watching it bestowed freely, correctly on a teacher, disrupted the math. He tried for humor. "Well, if she can get kids to read profit and loss statements, I'll fund the whole show," he said to the cluster nearest him, aiming for lightness, but the joke clanged. It revealed more than it concealed, the narrow corridor of his imagination, the behind-the-scenes calculus that had kept his generosity on a leash. A woman in a silver gown smiled at him without warmth and returned her attention to Sarah. Another donor, older and notoriously blunt, cleared his throat. "Reading anything is where it starts, Richard," the man said, not unkindly, but not deferential either. "You can't scale a life that was never given permission to grow." Richard forced a chuckle that didn't travel. He told himself to pivot, to find a new anchor. He scanned the room for allies, but even the most loyal smiled with that faintly distracted expression people wear when they are adjusting their narrative on the fly. They were not abandoning him, they were rearranging him. Position in a room is not just about where you stand, it's about what others now see when they look. In the small space at the center of that rearrangement, Sarah kept making choices that were the opposite of spectacle. When the president offered to laud her program with a few specifics, she redirected praise toward her students. By name, first names only, each accompanied by a fragment of a journey. Jamal wrote his own speech for city council and didn't shake. Maya tutors second graders now. Diego's grandma keeps every certificate on the fridge like a mosaic. Every line was a revelation wrapped in restraint. She refused to let recognition erase the people who made it necessary. Richard felt a tightness in his ribs, the kind that comes from running to catch a train that's already leaving. He tried again to insert himself. Mr. President, if there's a task force or a public-private partnership. The president nodded, courteous, but the reply curved back toward Sarah. We'll take your office's call, he said to an aide, then to Sarah, softer. Send me the reading list you give your kids. Richard blinked. Reading list. He measured influence in terms of capital deployed, introductions granted, doors opened. He had never thought of a reading list as a lever, but the way the president asked made it sound like a blueprint, like policy begins in the margins of a book, a child learns to trust. The orchestra, sensing the room's new tempo, offered a gentle refrain. Conversations resumed, now pulled towards Sarah's orbit. A senator leaned in to ask about attendance thresholds and food insecurity. A foundation head asked about mentorship pipelines. A journalist, trying not to look like a journalist, memorized the phrasing of Sarah's answers. The cumulative effect was not adulation, it was alignment. People were moving their weight to match a different center of gravity. Richard's face held, but inside something cracked with the clean sound of truth colliding with habit. He had always believed the journey to respect runs through scarcity. Make yourself rare, and the world will pay. Yet here was a teacher, abundant in the ways he had learned to ignore, and everyone with sense could feel the impact. He heard his own earlier whisper, "She doesn't belong here," and it echoed back at him, stripped of glamour. A brittle sentence that couldn't survive the air it was spoken into. He wanted to take it back, but humiliation does not move backward. It trains the future. He found himself near the edge of the forming circle, close enough to hear but not central enough to be necessary. Sarah glanced his way once, not to gloat, not to invite, just to acknowledge that he existed. The look was a paradox, gentle and unyielding, open and finished. He felt the faintest shock of recognition. This was not the first time he had been seen without being flattered. It just had been a very long time. Respect isn't a reward, Sarah was saying to the senator. It's soil. Kids grow in it. Adults do too. Richard swallowed. He wanted to reject the metaphor, to mock it privately as sentimental, but the image would not leave him. Soil. He thought of all the rooms he had curated where nothing could root, where everything was polished rock and reflective glass, where the only growth allowed was numeric. He imagined, for a breath he refused to prolong, what a room might feel like that was built to grow people instead of reputations. The thought landed and skittered, too new to hold. In moments like these, a man protects himself with movement. Shake a hand, make an excuse, cross to the bar, change the subject. But every exit requires an audience willing to accept the scene change. And tonight, the room had chosen its scene. His aides approached, low-voiced. "Sir, the photo line is shifting to the west wall." One said. Another added, "The president will do a small round table with Ms. Miller and education leaders. We can what?" Richard asked, more sharply than he meant to. The younger aide straightened. "We can participate if invited." The word invited made a bright, unwelcome mark in Richard's chest. He had not waited for invitations in years. He issued them. And yet, here it was again, the recalibration of proximity. The center was elsewhere, and protocol was rewriting itself around that. Fact. Across the marble, A boy in a too-big suit stood beside a server, eyes huge with what he'd just seen. Some staffers had brought a few kids from partner schools for the awards portion later. The boy tugged at the cuff of his jacket and whispered, as if trying the shape of a thought out loud, "She knows the president." The server, who had been following the scene with the sober attention of someone who notices everything, smiled. "Looks like the president knows her," he said. The line traveled past Richard's ear like a small bell. He exhaled, as if something he had been holding finally announced its weight. "This is a temporary pivot," he told himself, borrowing the language of markets to soothe a bruise it could not touch. "Narratives swing. They swing back." But even as he arranged the sentence, he sensed the flaw. This wasn't a swing. It was a correction, the kind that sticks. Sarah, for her part, kept doing what she had done all her life, translate attention into utility. When a foundation director asked what she needed most, she didn't say her name on a building. She said full-time counselors, a breakfast program expansion, a community library card that didn't require proof of address. Kids shouldn't have to prove they exist to access what helps them become who they are, she added quietly. The director wrote fast. The senator's aide underlined words. The president listened, not to be seen listening, but to adjust decisions. A room can feel the difference. Richard heard phrases he didn't usually track: trauma-informed, reading stamina, attendance as belonging, and they jostled oddly against his internal ledger of EBITDA, float, and yield. He stood there, a man fluent in markets, suddenly illiterate in the vocabulary of repair. He hated the feeling, not because learning was beneath him, but because ignorance exposed a behind-the-scenes truth. His influence had rarely left the surfaces of things. "Mr. Hayes," a reporter said gently, surprising. "Him. How does it feel to see your philanthropy intersecting with Ms. Miller's work?" The question was crafted to be merciful. He knew it. Mercy in public is its own mirror. He scoured for footing. "I believe in results," he replied, defaulting to the creed that had always fortified him. "If results are here, I'm prepared to scale them." It wasn't a disastrous answer, but it wasn't the answer the night had taught. The reporter nodded, thanked him, and turned toward Sarah. The humiliation had matured from moment to meaning. The very hand he refused was now the hand that oriented policy, partnership, and praise. No one said it this way, but everyone felt it. The refusal had disqualified him more than it had diminished her. That is the secret architecture of dignity. It doesn't borrow light, it generates it. Try to dim it and you'll only expose where your own shadows fall. For a breath, the room seemed to breathe with him. Inhale, exhale, reset. The orchestra shifted into a warmer progression. The master of ceremonies moved toward the stage, eyes on the president's staff for timing, while volunteers prepared a small set of chairs for that impromptu roundtable. The night was not pausing. It was transforming, aligning itself with a different story than the one the banners implied. Richard remained standing, less frozen than before, though still unsure how to move without pretending nothing had happened. In the space where certainty had lived, a quieter sensation pressed. Forward, not defeat, not yet humility, but the awareness that a door had opened he did not know how to name. Sarah glanced once more around the ballroom, her gaze passing briefly over him, then landing on the children waiting at the back with their chaperones. She smiled, a small private signal that said, "This is who this is for." The president followed her line of sight and nodded to an aide. A path began to form. The gravity of the evening shifted again, this time toward the future that had just stepped into the room wearing borrowed jackets and too big shoes. And as the chairs were arranged and microphones checked, the next movement of the night quietly assembled itself, ready to carry the revelation forward without fanfare, into the place where decisions are made and trajectories change. The atmosphere inside the ballroom no longer resembled the one that had existed when the night began. The chandeliers still glowed, the orchestra still played, and the marble still shone under. Polished shoes. But the hierarchy of the room had been rewritten. The transformation was almost invisible at first glance, yet undeniable if you lingered. Where before eyes followed Richard Hayes with expectation, now they gravitated toward Sarah Miller with genuine attention. The shift was not about spectacle, nor was it born of pity. It was the revelation of a hidden truth. True worth isn't found in the symbols of wealth, but in the quiet, consistent acts of character and compassion that reshape the lives around us. Richard, despite his stubborn attempt to keep posture, could feel the weight of the contrast. For years he had built his reputation on numbers, on appearances, on a narrative of triumph that positioned him as the center of every room. But recognition, when it came from the highest authority in the land, bypassed him and landed instead on the woman whose dignity had survived his scorn. He had spent a lifetime treating respect as a commodity, something to buy, display, and leverage. In seconds, that illusion cracked. Respect had chosen someone else, someone who had never asked for it, someone whose work had made her worthy long before anyone applauded. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't savor Richard's humiliation or weaponize the moment. That restraint was, in itself, the proof of her place. She stood with humility intact, her shoulders squared, not in triumph, but in steadiness. She embodied the mindset that character is not situational, that compassion is not conditional, and that the impact of a life is measured in ripples, not in riches. The president's recognition amplified what was already true. "You've lifted children out of poverty," he had said, and those words hung like an anchor against every shallow whisper Richard had voiced earlier. They reminded the room that Sarah's worth wasn't manufactured tonight. It had been forged across years of decisions no one photographed. Early mornings in classrooms that smelled of chalk and tired heaters, evenings writing grants at her kitchen table, afternoons reminding hungry kids that their dreams were not absurd. This was where her dignity came from, and it was this hidden journey that gave her presence tonight more gravity than any fortune could simulate. In the quiet of her thoughts, Sarah reflected on that truth without needing to speak it aloud. "I'm not here because of who I know. I'm here because of who I refuse to give up on." She remembered Marcus, Maya, Diego, faces that had appeared, unremarkable to others, but burned bright in her memory, because each of them had taught her something about persistence, about resilience, about how respect multiplies when it is given freely. "They're the reason," she whispered softly, almost to herself, though the words seemed to travel farther than she intended. Her comment reached a journalist near the stage, who scribbled it down quickly. It wasn't a quote meant for headlines, but it was the kind of line that stays in people's minds long after the lights fade. Because the story of Sarah Miller was not about a woman suddenly honored by authority. It was about how authority simply caught up to what had always been true. The moral revelation was uncomfortable for some in the room, particularly for those who, like Richard, had built identities on wealth as the final measure. They clapped politely, smiled when expected, but inside they wrestled with the reflection of their own lives. What would remain of them if the spotlight shifted? Away from money and toward impact? What legacy could they claim if the metrics changed? The unease was not cruel. It was clarifying. Richard's internal monologue betrayed him. Respect is earned, yes, but not this way. Not in classrooms, not with children. Yet even as he thought it, he knew the sentence was collapsing under its own fragility. He had dismissed children all his life as background, as beneficiaries of his occasional donations, but never as the true measure of anyone's worth. Watching Sarah, standing steady beneath applause she had never chased, he felt the hollowness of his reasoning. His humiliation wasn't just public, it was philosophical. A belief he had lived by had been dismantled in front of him. The narrator's reflection grew naturally out of that moment. Respect is not the applause of the powerful, but the testimony of those who have been changed by our choices. Wealth can build towers, but only character can build lives. Arrogance may demand attention, but humility commands it. In that ballroom, Where marble and mirrors once promised permanence, the truth revealed itself with simplicity. Greatness is not measured in what we own, but in what we give. Sarah's quiet dignity became the night's compass. She didn't seek to eclipse Richard. She simply illuminated the space he had darkened with arrogance. Her very presence above humiliation taught a lesson far sharper than any lecture. She showed that true influence comes from compassion without calculation, from integrity without audience. And though the president's recognition had cemented her place in the eyes of others, the deeper impact was that the crowd finally saw what had always been visible to those who knew her. She didn't rise above arrogance because authority lifted her. She had been above it long before. The embrace only made the truth impossible to ignore. The room, now quieter, carried a different energy. It felt less like a gala and more like a reckoning, as though everyone present was silently measuring their own lives against the standard they had just witnessed. Some shifted uncomfortably, some nodded in admiration, some resolved quietly to re-examine their decisions. Transformation, after all, begins in moments of discomfort. Richard remained stiff, outwardly polished, inwardly crumbling. His belief that money was the highest currency of respect had been shattered in seconds, and the shards were sharp. He was left with two choices: to gather them defensively and cling to what had been broken, or to let them fall and learn something new. For the first time in years, he didn't know which decision he would make. Sarah, unaware of the battles unraveling inside him, smiled at the children in the back of the room, the ones who had been invited as guests of honor. She raised her hand slightly, a small wave, as if to remind them that this night wasn't about her recognition, but about their journey. And just like that, the room followed her gaze, shifting from marble and chandeliers to young faces filled with wonder. The moral lesson lingered in the air like incense. Respect isn't owned by the wealthy, it belongs to the compassionate. Status is fragile, but dignity is unbreakable. And in that ballroom, where arrogance had tried to dominate, humility had written the final script. Yet even as the crowd absorbed the weight of that revelation, the night was not over. The applause began to fade, replaced by the sound of chairs being moved and microphones being tested. Something new was being prepared, something that would carry the lesson beyond symbolism and into action. The atmosphere held its breath again, not in tension this time, but in anticipation of what this transformation would lead to next. The applause faded into a low hum, the kind of quiet that doesn't signal an ending, but a shift into something deeper. Conversations softened, the orchestra adjusted their instruments, and yet all eyes remained in one way or another on Sarah Miller. She hadn't asked for this moment. She hadn't dressed for it, rehearsed for it, or even imagined it, but she carried it with a poise that made the grandeur of the room feel almost secondary. The president had returned to his table, aides in motion around him, but the glow of his words still lingered, their weight echoing through the marble hall. Richard Hayes stayed where he was, his champagne glass nearly empty, his posture rigid. He wasn't a man accustomed to silence directed at him. Usually, silence in a room like this meant waiting for his entrance, his announcement, his contribution. But this was a different kind of silence, the kind that leaves a person exposed, suspended in the knowledge that the crowd's gaze has moved on. Sarah stepped away from the circle of donors, excusing herself gently, her smile warm but never boastful. "Thank you," she said softly to those who offered her congratulations. "This isn't about me. It's about the kids, always about the kids." Her words weren't crafted for headlines or applause. They were plain, lived-in truths, and somehow that made them resonate more than anything polished ever could. She moved through the room with an ease that contrasted starkly with Richard's stiffness. Where he remained rooted, she walked, her steps steady, her demeanor calm. As she passed the children invited to the gala, she stopped briefly, bending slightly to meet their eyes. "This moment belongs to you," she told them quietly. "Never forget." That! Their faces lit up, their wide eyes reflecting something larger than chandeliers could ever provide. Hope. Richard watched, his jaw tight, his thoughts running like gears grinding without oil. He tried to remind himself of his empire, his penthouse, his cars, the portfolio that still bore his name in bold letters. None of this changes that, he muttered internally. But another voice, quieter and unwelcome, pushed through. Then why does it feel like it changes everything? Sarah's path eventually brought her close to where Richard stood. The air between them felt heavier than before, charged not with confrontation, but with the truth that could no longer be ignored. Richard's eyes flicked toward her, searching for scorn, for a victory smirk, for the smallest sign that she would use this moment to wound him as he had wounded her. But none of it came. Instead, she stopped just beside him, her smile as kind as it had been when she had first offered her hand. For a breath, the entire room seemed to lean in, waiting for what she might say. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. She spoke with the same calm tone she used in classrooms, the tone that carried conviction without force. "Respect was never mine to demand," Sarah said, her eyes steady on his. "It's something we give." The words landed like a bell, clear and resonant, vibrating through the room in a way applause could not. There was no gloating in her tone, no triumph carved at his expense. It was a reminder, a truth spoken as much for him as for everyone listening. In that single sentence, she framed the entire night, not as a spectacle, not as a battle won, but as a lesson revealed. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to respond, to argue, to reclaim the ground he had lost, but the words wouldn't come. Her kindness left no foothold for defensiveness, no space for him to twist the moment into something else. He felt suddenly small, and not in the way that invites sympathy. He was small in the presence of something greater than him, something he couldn't buy, bend, or control. Sarah moved on, her smile unchanged, her shoulders relaxed. She didn't look back, didn't linger. She had said what needed to be said, and in saying it, she had released herself from the humiliation he had tried to impose on her. The room seemed to exhale with her, a shared acknowledgement that they had all just witnessed something more profound than politics or wealth could provide. The orchestra began to play again, softer this time, almost like a soundtrack laid beneath the moment. Guests whispered, not in gossip, but in reflection. The president, watching from his seat, nodded slightly as though confirming the truth Sarah had just spoken. And in the corner, a journalist scribbled furiously, knowing the headline would never capture the real story, because the real story was not an event, it was a revelation. In a world obsessed with wealth, Sarah Miller had reminded them of a different metric. Greatness is not measured in the height of skyscrapers or the weight of bank accounts. It is measured in the respect we give, the compassion we embody, the dignity we extend, even when it is denied to us. And though the night was far from over, though conversations and speeches and photographs would continue, the lesson had already been written across the faces of everyone present. The transformation was complete. The arrogance that had once filled the room had been disarmed by humility, the silence broken by truth, and the balance reset by the power of character. And as Sarah disappeared gently into the crowd, leaving no trace of gloating behind her, the story of the night found its closing note, not in riches, but in respect. And still, even as the music carried the evening forward, there was a sense that this moment was not an ending at all, but the beginning of something larger waiting to unfold. And if you've stayed with me all the way through this story, maybe it touched something in you too. Moments like these remind us that dignity and respect are more powerful than any fortune, and that's a lesson worth carrying forward. If this message was for you, let me know in the comments. Just write something like, "I'm with you until the end, so I'll know you walked this journey alongside me." And while you're here, a quick like on the video helps keep stories like this alive, reaching more people who might need to hear them. If you want to keep exploring these kinds of powerful narratives together, subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss what's coming next. In fact, there's another story waiting for you right here that ties perfectly into this one. Click it, and let's keep going together.